Welcome to Numismatic Muse. My name is Clio, and I'll be your guide as I introduce history as told from the perspective of coinage. So let's get to it. Today we'll be discussing the history of Ireland, more specifically the history in relation to the coins which circulated within the country and their part in the history of the Emerald Isle. Since this video ran a bit long, I'll be dividing it in two parts, with the first focusing on early currencies through the hammered coinage. We'll start with the adaptation of some of the earliest currencies known in Ireland, ring money. While cattle and slaves were acceptable methods of payment far before ring money, they don't quite fit the framework of my video. This sets us somewhere between 1200 to 100 BC. Ring money was like hack silver, which were rough cuts of metal which would be assayed at exchange. These could be varied sizes and weights as opposed to most currencies which rely on a consistent weight to establish familiarity so they can be used freely. Unfortunately, not much is known about ring money. Some ring money was gold-plated rather than solid gold, which furthers the mystery since doing so would make it far more difficult to assay. Ireland stayed resistant to the adoption of early coinage. As money flowed between countries, what was introduced to Ireland was usually melted down to make ornaments similar to the previously mentioned ring money, as well as brooches and other trinkets. In about 995 AD, we have some of the first locally produced coinage. Here we see a Hiberno-Norse penny minted in Dublin under the rule of a king named Sithric Silkbeard. This design is based on an earlier style of coin which circulated in England under Athelred II. A variety of similar designs would be issued in Ireland up to 1095. It's a pretty cool design. I really like the look of the coins, and it shows the king's portrait as side-facing rather than the front-facing portraits, which I tend to dislike as they fail to show any reasonable depth. It was common for this style of coin to feature both names of the monarch and the moneyer. However, the spelling could change between one issue and the next. In times before dictionaries, getting your point across was paramount with no real importance to the spelling. These early coins are known as hammered coins. They are made by striking a small piece of silver or gold with two hand-cut dies. One would be known as the anvil die and the other as the hammer die. This type of minting process produces very thin and often poorly made coins. They could crack when being struck and often don't have the entirety of the design present on the coin. In only a century and a half, we have the Normans taking their foothold over Ireland. We're introduced to King John, who you'll most likely know as the king who signed the Magna Carta, or even more commonly perhaps as the King in Robin Hood. He had halfpennies, farthings, and pennies minted in mints in Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. These coins were primarily minted between 1177 and 1211 to fund King Henry's military efforts in France to reclaim lost lands. Our first issue would be minted while John was declared Lord of Ireland. The following issue, as you can see here, would be minted following his coronation as king in 1199. On the obverse, we see the front-facing portrait I referred to earlier and a moon and sun on the reverse. When I use these terms to describe either side of the coin, just keep in mind that anytime I say obverse, I am referencing the portrait side of the coin, or heads, as it is commonly referred to. The tailed side is called the reverse. Following King John's death in 1216, his 9-year-old son, King Henry III, would take the throne. He would issue coins in Ireland in 1251. Like his father, his main motivator for these coins was to remove silver from Ireland and into the royal coffers to be used as needed by the crown. Henry's son, Edward I, was granted rule of Ireland under the condition that it not leave the crown. Edward minted coins similar to this penny in the prior mentioned mints, but would also operate a mint in Cork, Ireland. These new examples would leave off moneyers' names entirely, as control of the mints was under tighter regulation. In 1302, the supply of Irish silver had all but dried up, and keeping the mints open in Ireland was no longer sustainable. This left Ireland sorely drained of its wealth, and when the beginnings of the Renaissance began in mainland Europe, there would be no chance of Ireland participating, as money for the arts was scarce. This would also begin an era of civil unrest against the crown. Following that, we have Edward II, who would produce no coins during his reign for Ireland. The next coins would be minted by his second son, Edward III in 1339. These coins, however, are rare enough to only have a handful of existing examples today, just 2 halfpennies and a single farthing. And as you can see, even the photos that we have of them, which are provided by the Royal Museum in London, are not the best. Nearly 100 years later, we have a small amount of coins issued by Henry VI, the great-great-grandson of Edward III. The kings Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V would not mint coins in Ireland at all. Henry VI would be thrown into royal rule from the age of 9 months old in the midst of the 100 Years' War, the youngest person ever to succeed to the English throne. He would produce a small amount of coinage in Dublin, Ireland in 1425, with only 3 surviving examples today. Once again, very difficult to get a good photo of, but you can see it here. In 1460, with Edward IV now at the helm, there would be faceless coins minted for Ireland under an anonymous crown. The coinage would be issued at 3/4 of their English counterparts, which does explain the reason for the anonymity. Later into his reign, coins would be minted in a more traditional style, with the king's head once again being featured on the obverse. These coins would be minted in as many as 7 different mints in Ireland. Later in his reigning, they would be reduced to just being minted in Dublin. Richard III would have a rough start into his rule, with his parents' marriage being declared bigamous and thus invalid. He would later be proclaimed as rightful king despite this. Not for long, however, as Richard would suffer a defeat at the hands of Henry Tudor and would lose his crown in battle. Henry VII becomes the first Tudor king, and coinage minted in Ireland during this time would have an array of designs and, depending on the location of the mint, clear favoritism via privy marks to their preferred ruler. Henry VIII didn't produce coinage for Ireland for a while into his reign, with the first pieces appearing on debased coinage in 1534. When I say debased, I just mean that the coinage was not minted up to the traditional spec, which would have been a sterling coinage, or 92.5% silver. These coins were unique in a few ways. For one, they were not minted in Ireland, but rather for Ireland, and they are the first items to carry the harp as an association for Ireland. These would be called harp groats, a groat being for pence. In 1540, the coins were debased a second time, along with a law against importing them back to England, which you can imagine wreaked havoc on the already troubled Irish economy. On this example, we see H and I on either side of the harp. These initials stood for Henry and Jane Seymour, his third wife. As a side note here, I cannot find reference as to why I would be using the abbreviation for Jane. If you happen to know, please do share with me in the comments. I find these initials being added an interesting practice. Not only do we have this here, he did this previously with an initial for his wife Anne Boleyn, and again with his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, before finally changing the initial on the other side of the harp to R, meaning Rex for king. I like to equate this to getting a tattoo with a girlfriend's name, only to get 3 more of their names also tattooed before deciding maybe it wasn't the best idea anymore. By King Henry's death in 1547, the coinage produced for Ireland would be reduced all the way down to 0.25 fineness. When Henry passed, Edward VI would take the throne, the son of Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. During his rule, coinage would be issued in Dublin again for the first time since his grandfather. However, these coins would be issued under the name of Henry VIII. While restoration to sound currency was imperative, the crown could not afford it. So in order to mask the fact that the new king was issuing debased coinage, the previous king was to take the blame from the grave. Mary Tudor would take the throne in 1553 following Edward's death, and a brief reign by Jane Grey, who Edward pushed to take the throne to keep the faith. Jane would be queen for just 9 days though, before pressure by the masses would force her out and bring in Mary and the Catholic faith once more back into the kingdom. Or, in this case, queendom. During Mary's reign, she issued coinage in Ireland following the reverse design of the coinage minted under King Henry VIII and her portrait on the obverse. For me, Mary is one of the best portraits on a hammered coin. Upon Queen Mary's death in 1558, Queen Elizabeth would take the throne. Her initial coinage for Ireland would be a continuation of low fineness base metal coinage. In 1561, she would restore sterling coinage to Ireland. However, it would not be long-lived, and in 1601, in the next Irish issues, it would be changed again to base silver to pay for troops that were ordered to suppress revolt led by the Irish rebel leader Hugh O'Neill. They would only surrender in 1603, just a few days following Queen Elizabeth's death. In 1603, James I would issue coinage for Ireland with high purity, but at 3/4 of the weight of their English counterparts. In 1613, farthing tokens were issued under a Lord Harrington and authorized as legal tender in Ireland and England. These peculiar little coins were stamped into a strip of copper and then punched out, as opposed to the process of creating a cut planchet first to use to strike. These can sometimes be found in the original strip unpunched. In 1625, Charles I became king following his father's death. During the first 15 years of Charles's reign, there were silver and royal farthings made privately under license of the king. However, in 1641, insurrection broke out in Ireland. Only a year later, civil war would break out in England. Lords Justices in Ireland minted coinage known as weight money, with crude designs of simple initials and denominations. A second issue would be made and come to be known as Ormond money, after the Earl of Ormond. During this time, there were some varieties of provisional issues. However, for the sake of time and availability of the information on the types, I will leave them off. So that's it for the video. I've covered the earliest types of currency in Ireland through hammered coinage. I'll be looking to do a follow-up soon with milled coinage forward, picking up in 1660. I hope you've enjoyed at least some of what's provided here and welcome any comments or constructive criticism. I will try to list all my sources in the video description for anyone who is interested. So, see you in the next video. Cheers.